Hello, you've reached the Spooky Chris podcast. Welcome. I am the aforementioned Spooky Chris. My name is Chris Ringler. This is my wee little podcast. You can find all of my podcasts at spookychris.com, as well as all my blogs, my reviews, my links to my books, and my short films and everything else. So for this little adventure, I had recently tried my hand at kind of making up a story freestyle, just kind of making it up on the fly on mic, and I wanted to try my hand at that again. I have an idea in my head, and I know where it's going to go. I just thought I would kind of challenge myself to see where we end up and where we start and all that. So that is what you're about to endeavor upon, is that kind of an adventure. It doesn't have a title that I can recall off the top of my head, but this is a piece of fiction. So as I drive into it, I don't expect anyone to think that the aliens are landing and that we've been invaded by Mars. So that being said, here we go. My brother Craig was not someone you would have heard about. Outside of the Tri-County area, he's not someone that would have a name that would ring a bell. He would just be another name on another list, like so many others. My brother, though, in our town and in the Tri-County area, was a bit of a legend. My brother Craig had been popular in school, had been an athlete. He had broken the long-distance running record for time by a full minute. The thought with his coach and my parents was that he would one day be an Olympian. My brother, for his part, didn't really take much creed in that. He loved to run. He loved to swim. He loved basketball. He loved sports. But they were just things he could do. Like some people can whistle. This was just something he could do. I was never any good at sports. I was never any good at that kind of a thing. I was usually more withdrawn, reading a book somewhere. I liked studying and learning. I was kind of a school geek. It was interesting because my brother and I didn't look alike at all, and our personalities weren't alike. We never interacted at school. We were 5 years different. And unless you knew our names, you'd never guess we were brothers. But when we were home together, it was different. There was no rivalry. There was no animosity. We were just kind of casual buddies. We each gave the other his space, and as we got older, that space got greater between us. But we were as close as I think you could have hoped for a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old to be. But my brother was famous for another reason. In the fall of his 16th year, this would have made it 1998, he did something extraordinary. He had been out for a run, and as he was running, it had started to rain. And near where we live, kind of out in the country, there are severe turns and curves and heavy woodland on either side. And on one stretch, there is a pond. The pond isn't terribly deep, but there's an area that drops down to about 15 feet. Now again, not very deep, but deep enough to cause trouble. My brother was running as the rain came down, and he had his headphones on, and he had my dad's old tape player on, and with a mixtape that his girlfriend at the time had made. And I only know these things because I looked. I looked afterwards because I was curious, like, what do you listen to when something extraordinary happens? And it was love pop songs and a few kind of raunchy rock songs. The kind of thing that a young couple would kind of, it's their language. The language of wanting. But nothing epic or extraordinary. But it didn't matter. My brother had been running, and as he was getting close to our house, the rain started to fall harder, making it hard to see. So he pulled the hood up on his gray track jacket, and he was nearing the pond, and he was never sure why. He just happened to look over into the pond and saw the ass end of a car. And he had to take a double take because he was sure he didn't see what he had. The fact was that it was a car. A car was submerged, and it had submerged to an angle that it was a small sedan, and it had submerged at an angle where the water came up and to right the very bottom of the back window. And my brother stopped, and he had a moment where he wasn't sure what to do. This was a time when it wasn't ordinary for kids to have cell phones or kind of ways to call the police. And he wasn't sure what to do, but something moved him. And he had told me late one night, there's the two of us awake in the dark. He had started to get nightmares after this. And he was asleep on my floor for the first month after, and he was awake, and I woke up and saw him awake, and I asked him what was going on. And he told me that it wasn't an act of bravery in his mind. He had to go and do this. He had to go and make sure. And he wasn't even sure what he's making sure of. That was the crazy thing. So he veered off the road and made his way down the hill. And the hill was heavily brushed, and you could see the deep tire marks in the mud where this car had gone. And my brother reached the edge, and he just jumped in. And he swam over to the car, and then he dove down, and he saw someone slumped in the seat. He wasn't, the back door wouldn't open. The front door wouldn't open. Nothing was opening, and he could only pound on it, and he'd have to go up and get air. And he went down again, and he did that twice. And then the third time he went down, and he tried this just out of sheer panic because the car was filling up. He tried the driver's side door one more time, and it opened. Just a crack, but he was able to pull and pull with all he had, with strength he didn't know he had, to get it open enough. And that was sheer luck that it wasn't a deeper pond, that the car hadn't gone further down. And he wedged it open enough that he could get his shoulder in and push it. And he told me again, had he not been a swimmer in school, there's no way he could have done this because he was down there so long. He said his chest was burning, and he lost track of how long he was down there, but he knew it was longer than he'd ever been underwater before. So he got the door open enough, and the water flooded in, and the water smashing into this person woke them up, and it was a young woman. And she was in a panic, and he reached out for her, and she fought him as much as she could under the water. And then it dawned on her where she was, and she was screaming. And as she was screaming, she was taking out this water, and her eyes rolled back in her head. and he grabbed her arm, and he pulled, and again, it was sheer luck. She hadn't latched the safety belt. She had put it on, but it hadn't clicked in. So she pulled to the side towards him, and it just came free. And he could feel it. His vision was starting to gray. He had been down there too long, but he couldn't leave her. So he was pulling and pulling, and he had pulled her with so much strength that he had pulled her arm out of her socket, and they only learned this afterwards. But he got her through that narrow space and free, and she floated upwards. And he like swam for all he had to get up and get some air, and they managed to break the surface at the same time, and he grabbed her other arm and started swimming to the shore. And he made it to the shore, and his head pounding, his chest burning, he pulled her up onto it, and she was unconscious, and he rolled her. And part of our school's swimming program is they would teach you CPR and life-saving techniques, just in case something happened. They wanted all of their swimmers to have that ability in case something were to happen during a meet. And so he started doing CPR on her. Never had seen this young woman before and didn't know who she was. She's a stranger. He thought she was maybe in her 20s. It turned out she was in her late teens, a girl from two towns over. She had been on her way to see her brother, who lived just past our town, and she had gotten caught in the rain, and her wipers didn't work, and she had missed the curve and went off. And he's working on her, and as he is, there's all these shouts, and there's lights, and he doesn't know what's happening, but he can't. He just keeps working on her, and finally she coughs up a mouthful of water, and then rolls to her side and just vomits all of this water out, more water than he could imagine that she would have in her. And she looked up at him, and he smiled because she was alive, and she just had a far off look in her eyes, like she just wasn't even there. So my brother turned, and there was an ambulance and a fire truck and a cop car and 2 cars, and he doesn't know where they came from. He learned later someone had seen him run and jump into the water and had called the police on their cell phone. Again, like it was this businessman who had it, and it was something he used in emergencies, he said, and he had used it to get help. And the ambulance took my brother and this girl. They loaded them both in. It was a small hospital at the edge of the county, and they took them both in. The girl was silent as they kind of warmed her up and checked on her. And my brother, again, they also were making sure he was okay. And he had some bruises, but he was generally okay. The girl, like I said, had her arm pulled from the socket, but otherwise was good. They went to the hospital, and everything was great. And then nothing. Nothing happened for a week. It just kind of came and went, and it was something my mother and father just prayed on every night, and thanked God that their son had lived. And he was very quiet about it. He didn't really have a lot to say. He just, like I mentioned, it was just something that he did. He had to do. He had no choice. Well, it was well over like a week and a half, and word got out. And I don't know if that was because the girl had been in the hospital. We were really kept in the dark, or someone had told someone. it was interesting because it was almost like it never happened. The rain washed the tracks away. They pulled the car out the next day. Nobody really talked about it. My brother never wanted to talk about it. So it almost like it didn't happen. But a week and a half later, and again, we live in a small area. There's no, the nearest news station is half an hour away. The local newspaper covers the school board meetings and the some of the local sports and local recipes, but they don't really cover hard news. So a week and a half later comes, and we get a call, and it was from the TV news, and they wanted to know if that was where Craig, and I'll leave our last name out, lived. My dad said, yeah. Very, very standoffish. That was Dad. Was not going to give you anything. And the person on the phone said, well, my name it was Teresa such and such from Channel 9 News. And they had heard about his story. And my dad said, what story? Again, like, very standoffish. He must have known what they wanted, what they were referring to, but he was very standoffish. I'm like, well, we heard that he saved a young woman, and we wanted to talk to him. My dad was like, I don't really know about this, because we were a private family. We were very quiet, and didn't want a lot of attention. That's just how we were. And my brother had come into the kitchen then, where the phone was. And the young woman had said, well, I understand your trepidation here, but as a matter of fact, this is going to be Mr. James Donahue's last show. James Donahue was their main anchor, and he would do people pieces. And it was called People Like Us. And is where he would kind of go man on the street style and talk to people and go where people were, and he'd just kind of like shine a light on regular people. James Donahue, it was going to be a last show, and James desperately wanted to speak to my brother for his last show about saving this young woman. My dad looked at Craig, and Craig kind of gave him a look and shrugged, wasn't sure what was going on. Dad held his hand over the phone and said, James Donahue wants to talk to you on the TV. And Craig gave him a strange look. I was at the kitchen table doing my homework, and Craig kind of looked at me and looked at Dad and again shrugged, and Dad shook his head no, and then Craig thought about it, and all this happened just in 30 seconds. And he kind of nodded his head and kind of gave another shrug, as a teenager does. And he said, sure. And my dad gave him a look and said, gave him the okay sign. He got on the phone like, okay, what's your contact number? And we'll get back to you. So he wrote down a number and hung up, and all of us got together and they talked. And my dad was like, why do you want to do this? I thought you kind of wanted just to let this go. And Craig said, well, when am I going to get a chance to be on TV? And we kind of laughed, because it was true. It was one of those things. Being on TV was still kind of cool and novel back then. You can kind of, it seems like you can fall into a TV or some kind of broadcast these days, but it was different then. So Mom and Dad agreed, and Dad called back, and they made plans, and we were going 2 days later into the studio so my brother could be interviewed by James Donahue on his last day. So we hung kind of backstage. It turned out it was a very small set. It was a desk and like a big TV behind them, and cameras in front, and then nothing, just kind of Nothing. So we kind of sat on a couch, and they weren't going to go on the scene this time. It was because they were kind of having a big to-do about James Donahue's last day. So they wanted to keep him in the studio because at the end of the broadcast, they were going to have a big kind of like we saw a cake back there, and there's balloons and all kinds of stuff. So they wanted to keep him there. So we came in the studio. We watched him do the broadcast. They did the opening news stories, and then did the kind of sports and everything. And then as it crawled to the bottom of the 5 o'clock hour, they motioned Craig over, and they got him mic'd up. They put a mic on him, and Craig had a tie on and a button-up shirt, which wasn't tucked in, and some khakis, and they sat him in a chair as they were at commercial break, and it was on a side set where there was a big fake tree, and then in the other chair was empty, and suddenly James Donahue came in, and he looked kind of frazzled. His hair wasn't as the thing about him is his hair was like so neatly parted. I swear you could have taken a ruler, and it was just not a hair out of place, and it was kind of tousled. He had rings under his eyes. He looked like he was having kind of a rough time. And you know what? Everybody, our family talked about it afterwards, and we kind of figured, it's his last day. It's probably hard to kind of hang it up. He chose to, but it was kind of got to be hard to kind of hang it up like that. And just having a hard time, and probably anxious to get the day over and everything. So he sat down, didn't talk to my brother, didn't do anything. Like, they put the mic on, they patted his face to get this, because he had been sweating a little, get the sweat off. And then he didn't even look at my brother. And then lights came on. All of a sudden, hello, I'm James Donahue, and let's meet someone just like us. And he turned to my brother, and he asked him, it's like, so, Craig, we hear you're a hero. Can you tell us about it? And my brother was nervous, but he kind of stammered his way through the story, as much as he could remember, and then what the police had pieced together, and told him. And James Donahue nodded, tapped his chin, said, "Ah, interesting. Yeah, it's just the kind of usual things." But it was a 2-minute segment, not very long. In the end of it, Craig said, and that's what happened, and it went so fast, because Craig didn't really have a lot to say. I was running, saw this car, blah blah blah. All told, the segment was, I think they said 3.5 minutes was what they were anticipating, but they could go to 5. James Donahue said, great, Craig, it's a pleasure to meet you. You're such a hero to this community, and I'm sure this young lady is very happy to be alive because of you. And he looked at the camera, and then he froze. James Donahue froze for 30 seconds, and nobody knew what to do. And finally they cut it just like that, cut the lights, came over and said, James, how's it going? And he's like, great, everything's great. And he got up, and he walked over to my brother. My brother stood, he held his hand out. You do the kind of polite thing. They shook hands, and then James Donahue leaned in and kind of gave him a weird kind of a side hug, leaned in towards his ear, and said something, and then nodded, and then walked away. And my brother kind of gave him a strange look, and then that was that. We went home. Mom had set the VCR so it would record. Had to go buy new VHS tapes so we could record the news segment, and we watched it. It was great, and it was interesting because you would never guess the weird way things concluded, because he looks at the camera for 10 seconds and then it cuts. So somehow they have been able to cut the feed sooner. And that was that. And we all went back to our lives. But Craig was a little different afterwards. That was really when he started sleeping in my room. As things have been okay, but he started to have nightmares after that night. So that weekend we had gotten a call from my aunt Joni, a nurse at the hospital that Craig had been at, and she had told my dad, and I had overheard that the young woman that Craig had saved had died. And my dad was like, "Oh, that's too bad. That's so terrible." And I could, heard him and Mom talking afterwards. And the young woman had killed herself. She had been in the hospital for for a week after taking on so much water, and hadn't really spoken to many people. Her family had come, her brother had come, to see her, and she just never had really perked up. They let her go, and she kind of went back to her life, and nobody knew anything else until they brought her in, and she had overdosed. And while they wouldn't, they couldn't say anything for sure, like it seemed clear she had intentionally overdosed. And it was really weird. They didn't tell Craig at first because they didn't know how he'd take it. But that did make the newspaper. And that was when my brother's name kind of came into the newspaper as the whole story started to come out. And then 2 weeks later, we were watching the news, and there was a story that James Donahue had been found dead. He had driven into a wall. Just driving home one night. He was a bachelor. He was driving home from a dinner he had by himself out in the city. He had been driving home, veered off the road, and right into the side of a grocery store, and had killed him. And that, Craig had been strange to begin with after the interview, and then finding out about the girl, and now this, and he became very withdrawn and very, very distant. And Dad and Mom started to get worried, but they didn't want to pressure him. He had a lot going on. It was getting near to finals, and there was just a lot of pressure. So I didn't want to push. And that's the thing is parents never want to. You never want to kind of push too hard, but then you don't push at all, and it's too late. They found my brother floating in the pond a week to the day after James Donahue died. He had gone to his girlfriend's, who was, a mile away, and he would just always walk there. And, he liked to kind of be alone, and he would go out there after school, and they had left school together, and he'd gone over to her house, and then he had been supposedly walking back and just never came back. And he was found the next morning by an old couple that had been walking their dog. And that kind of thing. Your family doesn't really come back from. I would never say he was the favorite son. I don't think that's fair to say about my mother and father. But it was clear that had affected them deeply. And I understand. I mean, how could it not? and it affected me. There was just no way to get past that. That was kind of a weight that wouldn't leave us. And so time went on, and as I got older, his absence grew heavier, and it was just strange. Mom and Dad got distant. They were still not good parents. They still went through the motions of being married, but there was a divide between them, and I couldn't get out of my head the entirety of it all. Like Craig finding that girl, going on TV, the strangeness with James Donahue dying, the girl dying, my brother dying, all of them dying in quick succession, with the girl being first. And one night, I was 11 when he died, and it was when I was 15. And I was in bed, and I don't know why, but I had a dream about Craig on the news and about the handshake, and it was as if something had happened there. I remember the look on Craig's face, and he had been so happy, and then something kind of crossed it, and he wasn't sure, as he was hearing something he wasn't sure how to take, and he wasn't sure how to process. And I could see that James Donahue was whispering something into his ear, and then he pulled away and he nodded to him and then walked away. I asked Mom, I asked Dad, do you remember that? Do you remember what happened? And they said, we don't really want to talk about that anymore. I went through our tapes and couldn't find the tape. It was gone. And Dad had said they'd thrown it out. That they just didn't want it around anymore. So there was a strange mystery, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. So back then there was something called the Usenet. And you would get on your computer, and it was kind of similar to message boards, how they work now, but they were basically message boards. And I started going, kind of looking for message boards about strange things, or local things, and I was just looking. I would do internet searches for that news station, for James Donahue, for my brother's name, anything. Couldn't find anything, and I don't know what I was looking for. But something was wrong. Something had happened, and I wasn't sure what it was. Well, I posted on a board. I lived in Conway County at the time, and I found a message board on, it's America Online. It was an internet service, AOL, and it was Creepy Conway. And it was people telling ghost stories and stuff. And I popped up and I said, hey, did anyone remember James Donahue? And a few people said, yeah, I responded. And one guy popped up and he said, yeah, I used to work with him. And I was there for his last broadcast. And it was they just ended it with freaky. And I responded. I said, I was there too. And we exchanged email addresses because I didn't really want this to be public. And I said, hey, this is who I am. My brother was on there, and this guy, he had information that he had worked there. He said he ran the audio board back then for the station. He was working at a bigger station now. He said it was all really weird, that James Donahue had been very strange the whole day. Nobody was sure what was going on, and even when they did his sign-off, he had kind of just gotten distant and quiet and just kind of zoned out. And it was very weird. And I mentioned, he said something to my brother, and it really kind of weirded my brother out, and I've always kind of wondered what he said. And he was like, I remember that actually, because a few of us in the room in the command center had seen that's why, well, one of his coworkers had pulled, had dropped the camera and it had stopped the feed, and they were all kind of just weirded out by it, and they had recorded audio. They had not stopped the audio yet. It didn't go out, but they had recorded it. And I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yeah, I actually might have a connection to try to track some down." He's like, "It's possible they would have gotten rid of it, but it's hard to say. They like to keep archives just in case, there's a anniversary or something that they need something, and they don't, you don't want to really get rid of things unless you have to." So he said, "Give me a few days, and I'll see what I can do." A few days went by, a week went by, a week and a half, and I hadn't heard from him. And I emailed him, didn't hear from him. Like, shoot. Like, I was bummed because I thought, I was going to get some answers. Well, finally, 3 weeks later, I get an email, said, "Hey, sorry about that. Life happens. My friend was able to pull audio. I'm not sure if this answers anything. I listened to it, and I don't know what to make of it. But he caught that clip, and he had attached it." So I was really excited. I mean, I don't know what I expected to hear. And so I played it, and it was muffled, like, the sound of, people getting up, and my brother's like, "Oh, thanks so much. This was a real pleasure." And James, I don't know if you could hear him getting close, and he had leaning towards, you could hear him getting close to my brother's microphone, and you could hear him breathing, like, very hard. And just out of nowhere, he said, "They're up there. They're up there watching, and they won't do anything." And then I heard my brother say, and then, you could hear the people coming in to kind of check on him and get the mic off and everything. But that's where the audio cut out. And I listened to it probably 100 times. They're up there, and they won't do anything. And I don't know what it means to this day. I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't know what it means. But I wonder, my brother was different after he heard that. It was different after all of it. And I just think of James Donahue sometimes, and what went through his head when he drove himself into that wall, and my brother wondering what went through his head when, and everyone says it was an accident. It was an accidental drowning, but I just don't believe it. I believe my brother intended to go into that pond and intended to drown himself. They had found a big stone in his pocket that was smooth, so they thought, well, he probably picked it up, but I think he was trying to weight himself down, and maybe just didn't, I don't know, something happened and he didn't need to, but I think he had the outcome he intended. But I wonder what went through his mind, and wonder what went through that young girl's mind when she made her decision. All three people tied, directly or indirectly, to one incident on a distant road far away from everyone on a rainy day, where they were watching and wouldn't do anything from above.